Namaste. Sri Krishna is saying in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 5, verses 5 and 6, the state attained through wisdom, Jnana Yoga, the path of discrimination known as Sankhya, is the same as that attained by action, the science of yoga. The two paths lead to one universal realization. Renunciation, however, O mighty-armed Arjuna, is difficult to achieve without God-uniting activity, or yoga. By the practice of yoga, the Muni, whose mind is absorbed in God, soon attains the perfection of oneness with the Absolute. I used to visit, whenever I could, the woman saint in India, Ananda Ma, and it was very interesting. She was quite illiterate. She couldn't read anything. She didn't know the Shastras from reading them. If she signed her name, sometimes people would give her a picture of her and want her to autograph it. She would put a little point there indicating infinity, but she couldn't do it outwardly. She didn't have this intellectual knowledge that comes from an education. And yet pundits from around the country would come to her and ask her for an explanation of this passage or that passage in the Shastras. And she would say, well, read it to me, and then I'll answer you. So they'd read it to her. She couldn't read it. And then she would answer them learnedly, and she knew much more than they did. Well, the truth of a thing is not what you've read with your intellect. It's what you know with your heart. There are more, actually, at least as many nerves in the heart as there are in the brain. The heart has its own particular understanding. And when you understand with the heart, you can understand much more deeply and truly than you can with the brain. This is why chitta, which means feeling, is also a definition of consciousness. And books will say the lower consciousness. Well, it's consciousness itself. They are nowadays talking about computer rights, thinking that someday computers will become so sophisticated that they will become conscious. Well, of course they have the ability of a reasonable reasoning mind to solve problems very quickly. And of course we use them to solve those problems to save us time. So in a way they're more intelligent than we, at least in the way they've been programmed in certain ways. But the thought that these computers or these robots will ever become self-conscious and that we need to worry about computer rights, that's quite ridiculous. But let me explain why. What could be simpler? We're talking of complexity in a computer and so on. What could be simpler than a worm? And yet a worm is obviously not only conscious, but feeling. Feeling and self-consciousness, feeling and self are very similar. And so if you prick a worm with a pin, it'll wriggle away. And if a bird tries to catch, it'll try to dig into the ground and escape the bird. It is self-conscious and it feels. These are things that no scientist will ever be able to replicate. I'll put it this way, that if ever he is able to create a body sufficiently able to function in a human way, if there is a consciousness that comes into it, it will come from the astral world, as it does anyway. When you have the sperm and ovum joining, it isn't that sperm and ovum subdividing on their own and gradually taking on the form of a body. The soul is attracted from the astral world by the flash of light in that world. And if its vibrations are similar to the soul, then the soul may enter that, and sometimes you get more than one soul come in, and so you have twins or triplets. But the entering in is the only way. No scientist can ever, by just working and manipulating physical things, can ever accomplish these two things, consciousness and self-consciousness, feeling and self-consciousness. So chitta, that's why what we need to do is overcome the waves of chitta, the reactions to this and that and the other. So the path of Sankhya and the path of yoga, finally you see that they're all the same thing. It's all one reality, and these are all just little departments, and the intellect likes to separate one thing from another. But the chitta, when it's calm, unites everything. And true wisdom, and if you will do this in yourself, you will find it a very practical teaching. If you are puzzled as to what you ought to do in life in some particular situation or another, don't just sort of try to figure it out. You can figure it out for now till doomsday, you might say, and still you won't be there. What you have to do is ask in the right way. And this is the broadcasting station of this radio of the human mind, and this is the receiving set. And if you will ask this question in the right way, you will find that you get the answer here. Now this is why doubt, for example, is an obstacle on the path. It's a necessary thing if you're having a positive doubt. You don't want to accept truths blindly. You want to know if they're really true or a delusion. And so we must use our intellect, but we have to use it in the right way. So use it in that way that when you ask a question, you get a response that brings your energy upward. Now, in many ways, for example, when I am writing and I will come to a problem, and this has also happened interestingly in another way I'm going to explain in a moment. When I ask the question, sometimes because I'm asking for myself, I don't get an answer. But if somebody else asks me that question, then I'm trying to give an answer. And in that act of giving, suddenly I know the answer. So yoga teaches you the how of all of these things. Not just the need for it, the why of it, but the how. And this yoga is not just doing pranayama and assuming strange positions and standing on your head and holding your breath and breathing the left nostril and the right nostril and all that. Yoga is the way you live your whole life. And if in your life you always remember these truths, that to be successful in what you do, this is again why it's important to be outwardly active also, because then you can see the results of what you're doing. If it works, then you can assume that you're doing it in the right way. It's not so easy as I'm saying, obviously. Otherwise everybody would be rushing toward God. But basically speaking, what I am saying is true. In other words, I want to say it this way too, that you may do something adharmic and find success. And so you may say, as some people do, well, what's the use of all this yoga? I can cheat and lie to people and get rich, and what does it matter? I'm rich, aren't I? Okay, you won't be rich for long, and you will be unhappy when you're wealth. These are the ways to give man what he himself wants. He wants to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. And if you act in undharmic ways, sooner or later the karma will push you in toward pain and so on. So remember that it isn't necessarily the immediate results, because you may have to be battling against the contrary karma, so that no matter how good you are and how seriously dharmic you try to be, you may find that you don't succeed. This is why it takes discrimination. This is why also it takes patience. And this is why it's a help to live in society, because we can see that in general what happens when people live right, they are happy. And when people don't live right, they are not happy. And this is what is the benefit of living in a community. Because in this world, people may pass through your life in many different periods of your life of people you knew as a child, you don't know when you're an adult, or you don't know when you're old, or whatever it might be. But in a community, you get to see the people there for a long period of time. We've been there now nearly 41 years in Ananda communities. And we've seen hundreds of people and what effect their actions and attitudes have on their life. And we've seen that certain attitudes don't work. In every case, for example, people who come thinking, what's in it for me, they're not happy. They don't work well there. People who come and think in terms of getting more importance, it doesn't work for them. Bit by bit, you see that what is right for the majority of people is the best thing. So you don't have to experiment on your own life only. Yes, in your own life, it may take a long time for the results of a particular action to bear fruit, whether good or bad. But in a community with many people, you can see by and large all those people who live in the right way, and it always corresponds. I can say this with certainty. Those people who have lived in the way that the scriptures indicate is the right way to live, they are always happy. And those who think first of themselves, they are never happy. So by living in society, and especially living in a small community where you can see people all the time and see what they're doing and how they're helped or hurt, you realize that the true wisdom is that which takes you toward Him. Then yoga comes into that just naturally. You naturally will turn from the need for it to the doing of it. And you see that in the doing of it, that when you think of other people's welfare and not your own, we have seen those who lived that way and who gave away what they had but gave sensibly, they prospered. Those who did not prosper. And there are subtleties to it too. For example, in the early days of Hollywood, the movie actors got lots and lots of money, but they didn't know what to do with it, and they would give it away to anybody who asked for them, and pretty soon some of them died in penury, and so they discovered that it's a wise thing to give generously, not just give indiscriminately. And like Polonius, it says, Shakespeare says in Polonius in Hamlet, through Polonius in Hamlet, he says, neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loseth both itself and friend. Well, you find this to be true. But on the other hand, in generosity, those who have lived for other people and weren't thinking in terms of making sure that they were secure and had what they needed always, they're the ones who have prospered. Whereas those who thought first only of their own needs and their own prosperity, they have not thrived. It does not mean that those who live the right way become rich, but then they don't want to be rich. To be rich means you're being selfish. If you give to people, I remember I said to my mother once, she was talking about somebody with large properties and everything, and I said, just imagine spending all that money just on yourself. And she was sort of surprised. She said, well, that's a new take on things. Well, to me, it's a natural take. I remember one time I was going through a physical trial and physical problem. My health was very bad. I had a blood pressure of 200 over 120, and I could easily have gotten a heart attack or a stroke or something. And I asked my father if he would help me to do what the doctor had told me I absolutely had to do, go and take a rest somewhere. And the suggestion had been to go on a cruise in the Caribbean. So I asked my father if he would help me. And his answer was, Don, you've just got to stop giving all your money away. Well, I hadn't given it away. I just shared it. That's different. I never felt that I was giving anything. I started Ananda to help other people. And I showed him up. The money somehow came to me. Different people pitched in. I did take that cruise, and it did help me. But he never understood it. Most people think that what you have, you got to hang on to. That's why when he died and he left me a fair amount of money, I wouldn't want to keep it for myself. But I knew that his soul, and wherever he went, and I think it was heaven, I'd like to think so, he would have suffered. And so for consideration for him, and also for consideration for myself, I didn't want to keep the money for myself. So I decided to build a center that would be good for the whole community. So I built the Crystal Hermitage with a beautiful garden, and people come from different states even to see it during the tulip season, and it has been a beautiful thing. It's my home, but it's also the spiritual center for the whole community, and we have many functions there all through the year. Well, when you share what you have, I haven't become rich. I don't want to be rich, but I've always found that what I need, I had. And that need has been supplied sometimes in very unexpected ways, but it's always been supplied. The one thing people forget is that there is a God up there, and to him you're not just a little ant, you're his own self. In fact, it sometimes amazes me when I think about this spiritual teaching, how very similar human and divine consciousness is. We know that they're not similar in very basic and universal ways, the first of them being that we have this sort of attachment to this little atom rather than oneness with the whole universe. But there's such a similarity there, and yet the more you are on the path, the more you find that God is in everything. And as you act in the right way, you find his support. You're not just an ant to him. He's in your own little flickering thoughts. Jesus Christ said that nothing can happen, and a leaf cannot fall even. The hairs on your head are counted. Everything is a part of the omniscience of God, and equally a part, so that God is not impelled by this consciousness of the relative separateness, that this is more important than that. Everything's important to him, because everything is equal, and everything's a part of his bliss. And so the more you live in the thought that you are living for him, the more he will take care of you. And it really is amazing how often he did. One time I was in Delhi, I was visiting India from the West, and there was a person whom I wanted to meet who lived in Bhubaneswar. When I flew to Calcutta, I wanted to see him, but I didn't know his address, and I didn't know how to get there. And Bhubaneswar is an overnight train ride from Calcutta. So I was wondering about this, but I arrived in Calcutta, and the people who were to meet me didn't get there. There was a traffic jam. So I was there not knowing what to do, and usually when that happens, you rush to the phone and say, "Where are you?" and so on. I just quietly said, "Well, Divine Mother, what do you want?" Suddenly somebody stopped in front of me, and he said, "What is your name?" And I told him. He said, "Oh, I thought you must be a friend of mine," and he talked about this man, a Dr. Mishra. "A friend of mine has told me about you, and I've been longing to meet you." And I said, "Well, I've wanted to meet him, and how can I find him?" He said, "Well, he happens to be in Calcutta right now, and I've come to meet him." And it turned out that there were no hotels vacancies at that time. But I got to find this man, to meet him, and to spend time with him and have a room, all because I just waited for God. Joy to you.